Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, we are kicking off our Linux command line series. It's going to be a lot of fun, going to learn a lot about Linux, and joining us in the studio, our good friend, Mr. Don Pezet. Don, welcome to the show, sir. Thanks for coming today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Daniel. And this is a really fun topic for me. Diving into the shell and actually getting things working. We've got a series coming up on bash scripting that's going to have a ton of really cool things that you can do that are all driven by the command line. So we need to know how to get in and interact with that shell, interact with the interface that we have to actually kind of talk right to the Linux kernel and get it to do some really neat stuff. And one of the things that I always try and remember is that in the Linux world, almost everything is developed from the command line first, and then eventually gets a nice little GUI stuck on it, a graphical user interface. But if you just stick in the graphical environment, you're really limited. There's only so many things you can do. And when you pull those shackles off and dive right into the command line, sky's the limit. So you can do so much stuff. So I'm excited to dive into it here in this episode, and really the whole series, to be able to see what we can do from the command line, how we can use it, and some of the neat utilities that are there that let us talk to that system.
Well, Don, when we start talking about terminals, right, the command line stuff, there are terminals. There's a little black box that pops up, and we type command into it, and we think, oh, that's kind of vanilla, but there's a bit more to it than that, right?
Yeah, in the olden days, where we had a mainframe or something of that nature, you would have a dummy terminal. And a dummy terminal was a keyboard and a monitor, and when you sat down at it, you would just see a command prompt. You didn't have a graphical user interface. You didn't have a mouse. But on most computers these days, when you sit down at them, you actually get a graphical user interface. So that the terminal, the command line, is kind of hidden away behind the scenes. All right. So we need to know how to get to it. And fortunately, there's actually a number of different ways to get to it. Now, remember that Linux, whether it's running as a desktop or whether it's running as a server, it really is the same under the hood. There's a lot of operating systems that differentiate. You have Windows Server versus Windows Desktop, two different products. But in the Linux world, it's really the same. The big difference is that when you install Linux as a server, you normally leave the GUI off. So if you push the power button on a Linux server, on the screen you see the text-based terminal, the command prompt that you can jump into and start to work with, right? But if you do it on a desktop, you get a graphical user interface. Some people put a graphical user interface on a server. You're not really supposed to, but you can. So either way, if we get the graphical interface, how do we get at it? Well, it's not that the text-based one is gone. The text-based one is just kind of hidden away. So let me show you here on my laptop. So this is my laptop. I use it every single day, and so I have a graphical user interface on it because I don't want to do everything from the command shell, although I do a surprising amount of things. Yeah. So when I log in, it's graphical, right? So I can launch in here and I can browse my files and do all the different things that I need to do right here through a GUI, and that's great, right? But if I want to access the terminal, the command prompt is actually running in the background. I just don't see it, right? On most Linux distributions, you actually have usually about 6 text mode terminals that are running in the background that you're just not seeing. All right, they fire up briefly while the computer's booting up, and then the GUI loads and takes over from there. So I'm in X Windows, and the GNOME Window Manager is all kind of running and giving that GUI. If you want to see the text-based stuff, you can, but it's not as good as it used to be. And the main problem with that is high-resolution monitors. So the monitor on my laptop, I forget my resolution, it's something like 3200 by 1800, something ridiculous like
crazy.
That. And high-resolution monitor, even like a 1920 by 1080 monitor these days, makes the terminal almost unreadable.
It's like a postage stamp on your screen. It's crazy.
It's really tiny. So here, let me pull mine up, and I'm just going to switch right over to one of my text mode terminals. So you're going to see my monitor blank out, and then there it is. Okay, I'm now in a text mode terminal, and it's asking me to log in. Now, how do I know that? Because if you look, I mean, that is really, really small. I know for you guys in TV land, you're seeing this in the little boxed-in view. But even if you were to full screen it, it's really small. Even looking at my own monitor, it is really small. I can barely read it. And unfortunately, there's no way for me to adjust that without like really going in and re-engineering this terminal. You have to put in a giant font and all this other stuff. So it's not an easy way to do it. As a result, this is not how we normally access the terminal. If you ever want to do this, the keyboard shortcuts are Control-Alt-F1 then it's usually Control-Alt-F1 through F7. And one of those will have the GUI, okay? Most operating systems today put the GUI on F1. So if I hit Control-Alt-F1, it should return me back to my GUI, all right? Some distros put it on F7, though, and you hit Control-Alt-F7, and there you go. Meanwhile, 1 through 6, or whatever ones aren't used, those are the text-based terminals. So they're there, they're running, and you can use them. If you ever lock up your graphical user interface and you're stuck, you can drop to one of those terminals and try and fix the problem. It's nice to have, if you also have a magnifying glass. So that's not the normal way that we get into our command prompt, to get into that kind of session to talk to the Linux kernel. So instead, what we normally use is a terminal program. And there are a number of different terminal programs that are available. And what you'll find is that over time, you'll find one you really like, that you'll kind of bond with, you'll team up and be buddies.
That's like the Linux manifesto, right? Is do it the way you like to do it. And there's many options on this smorgasbord of different things that do kind of the same stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no right or wrong answer here. Like, you need to find the one that works out the best for you. Now, the best piece of advice I can give you is don't just use what I use, because you know, what I use is just what I like. And I get a little bit lazy sometimes. Not lazy as in I don't want to do work, but lazy as in I'm in a hurry and I want to get to a terminal as fast as I can. So there might be some flashy terminal that has a lot of bells and whistles that's awesome, but if it's not installed by default, I don't want to deal with it because I don't have time to install the terminal. I want to use something that's already there. So a lot of times I'll pick one that I know is not as feature rich. So don't let me influence you. You need to find out what works for you. Or you might agree with me and say, hey, I only want to use stuff that's installed natively. I don't want to have to install extra packages to get to some crazy terminal. Now, when you install your Linux distro, it will have at least one terminal available. And so you can use whatever GUI you've got. If you've got Unity, or I'm on GNOME here, or if you have KDE, when you bring up your menu and you just type in terminal, something's going to come up. Okay. Now, I have a number of terminals installed on my machine, so I see several choices, but you may only see one, right? It just depends on the distro. And the one that you'll normally have is this guy right here. He's called Xterm, right? The X Windows GUI is kind of the de facto standard for graphical interfaces. Now, that's changing. We have a replacement for X Windows called, or Xorg is what that's actually called. That's slowly being replaced by a product called Mir. Sorry, not Mir, Wayland. There we go. I'm going to get my managers right. So Wayland is kind of taking over. So you might not have Xterm in that case, in which case you have other terminals that might be available. But normally a distro will take some terminal and label it as just plain old terminal. Okay. Now, in a GNOME environment, that's actually linking to what's called the GNOME terminal. In a KDE environment, this would be linking to what's called console, which I actually have installed also, or console with a K, because it's from KDE. But there are other terminals that are out there that you might see. All of them provide the same basic functionality, but then some of them add a lot of bells and whistles that enable you to do some really neat things. So if I were to launch into Xterm, that's the oldest one. That's the most basic terminal. And when I get into it, I see something pretty small. and you know, if I were to zoom in, I can read it now, right? But Xterm is really operating the same way as those text mode terminals in the background. It's just putting a GUI wrapper around that terminal. And I can get in and I can do some like set term commands to try and change the background color and other things to try and make it useful. But as far as the GUI is concerned, there's not really any options for me. There's not much of a menu here other than minimize and maximize. And even if I go up to the menu items up here, there's just quit. I don't get a lot of functionality with Xterm. This was the original graphical terminal that was made available, and so it's got a very basic set. So most of us aren't going to use that one. Most of us are going to use GNOME Term or console if you're in KDE, but GNOME Term is really the most popular one. If you're running Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, Red Hat, CentOS, all of those distros default to GNOME Term. Ubuntu is using the Unity window manager, but the Unity window manager actually uses GNOME Term as its terminal. So even though it's not GNOME, it's still using that terminal. So that's kind of the most popular one, and that's the one that I'm going to use for the rest of this series. So for the whole series, I'm going to be using the GNOME terminal. But I want to walk you through a few of the other terminals here in this episode to give you an idea of which ones might be great or which ones might be lame.
They get kind of fancy, don't they, Don?
They really do. Some of them have some really impressive feature sets. So, for example, let me just fire up real quick. We'll breeze through a few real quick, and then I'll do a deeper dive into some of them. So, for example, the GNOME terminal. If I just fire up my terminal, this is the GNOME terminal. It's the default built one in. See how I got a nice big font? Well, it didn't have that by default, but I was able to change it because I've got all these menu options up here where I can tweak it. I can change the font size. I can change the colors. I can change what's being rendered. There's a lot that you can do.
I love the fact that once you make those changes, a lot of these will have profiles you can create and say, I want this to be my default profile, and that way, if I want to do different things, I can just load different profiles, and it's already preset for me. That is a fantastic option on newer style terminals like this.
Yeah, and some of the other features they add really take advantage of the GUI. Like if I need more than one terminal open, I can open more than one window, right? You can go up here to File and Open Terminal, and now I've got 2 terminal windows open, so I could run 2 different commands. But this one actually has tabbed terminals as well. Under that File option here, I had Open Tab. And so now I could have 2 tabs, or 3 tabs, or 4 tabs. You just do Control-Shift-T, and I get more and more tabs. So I might run something like, maybe I run Midnight Commander, which I don't have installed. So let me install Midnight Commander. So I'm installing a program here, and while it's installing, I could jump over to another tab and be doing work. And then when I come back to the first tab, it finished installing, I can run Midnight Commander, so now it's running, and I can switch over to another tab and perform more work. And so I can take advantage of those tabs to do more than one thing, all from right inside of the terminal. So that's kind of a nice feature to have that we didn't have in the older Xterm, or you definitely don't have in the text-based console if I do Control-Alt-F1. Although I could Control-Alt-F1, F2, F3, and move between them. That was the earliest form of multitasking, that you could run these full-screen or locked applications that would lock your session and just switch over to another terminal and fire up more applications that way. So you had that functionality. Now, GNOME Term is pretty powerful, but there's some things that it doesn't do that other consoles or other terminals might do that you appreciate. So, for example, I use one called Guake, G-U-A-K-E. Guake is nice because it is built off of, it's actually modeled after the old video game Quake. In the video game Quake, it was one of the first video games that had a drop-down console. You could hit, I think it was tilde on the keyboard, and this little console would drop down from the top of the screen, and you could type in cheat codes. That was really all you ever typed. For people like me that use a terminal a lot, I'm constantly going to the terminal. I don't necessarily want it to be a window that pops up like this. I would like it to just be something that I can quickly access. And if you install Guake, it's running in the background. I've actually got a little tool item, whoops, somewhere up here, that shows it. Well, anyhow, it's way up here, this little tool item. And I can hit F12 on my keyboard, and there's a console that pops up, and I have that access. And so if I want to jump in and run something really quick, I can. And it's really handy if I'm out like browsing on the internet and I come across some tutorial, right? So, maybe I'm doing a Vim tutorial to learn some Vim commands. And so I'm here and I'm reading about how to do something, and then I pull up that terminal, I run something real quick, I get it out of the way, and so just tied to my F12 key, I can make that pop up and come and go. So that's a neat feature. It's a different terminal, but I like it because it gives me some functionality that I don't have in the normal terminal, right? Another one that I use from time to time is Terminator. Terminator is a third-party terminal that's available in Ubuntu and Debian, Fedora. It's available in all of them. And it has a neat function in that it lets you split the screen, right? In GNOME Terminal, I could do tabs. And if I had multiple tabs, I could have multiple terminals. But I couldn't see them both at the same time, right? If I wanted to see more than one thing at the same time, I could fire up Terminate, and with a simple right click, I can split horizontally or split vertically. So I'll do a vertical split, and now I've got 2 terminals side by side. And I could even come in and take one, and I could split it horizontally, and now I'm starting to lay these out where I've got all these different terminals. And that's handy because I might be running something like HTOP here, so I'm monitoring performance on my server. And then down here, maybe I'm doing a little journal CTL-F, and so I'm following my systemd logs, right? So now in the top left, I'm seeing system performance. In the bottom left, I'm seeing what's going on. And in the right, I could be doing my work. I could come in and I could say, well, I need to restart some service. I'll restart oh, I don't know, I'll restart my network stack, right? Why not? So I'll restart something, and I can see the log messages down here being generated as part of that restart, and I can see any CPU or memory activity that was modified by it, and I can start to do more than one task. That's a pretty neat function, right? Being able to slice up your screen like this is not something I can do in GNOME, but I can easily do right here in Terminator. So that's where I go back to saying, like, when it comes to picking a terminal, there's a ton of them that are out there, and you need to find the one that you like best. These guys right here, they each have some kind of shining advantage to them, right? Terminator can split the screen, but it's not installed by default. I would have to install it if I wanted to use it, right? So if I'm in a hurry on a system, I might not want to install it. I might want to use something that's built in. But boy, slicing up the screen like this is pretty handy, right? Same thing goes for Gwake. It's really nice to have that drop down from the top, but I have to install it and get it set up. It's not installed by default, so I might not want to deal with that. It's kind of a pros and cons type approach. You need to find out which one meets your needs.
Yeah, Don, I really like how it splits the screen for you, because if you've ever tried to, and even if you come from a Windows background, you're like, oh, let me check out this Linux thing. You have the black screens and you're moving around, you're trying to, snap to this side, snap to that side, and try to get everything look just like you like. Where if I'm just, okay, split this, split that, and it's kind of doing that for me. It takes a lot of the hard work out of it, of getting everything lined up perfectly. And that kind of takes us into something else, Don, which we kind of alluded to, which was customizing these terminals. Can you walk us through some of that customization?
Yeah, so let me fire up my regular GNOME terminal again, and I want to show you guys profiles, all right? Profiles, Daniel mentioned them earlier, are a way that we can kind of customize our terminal and change the way that it appears and get it to suit our needs. The default profile from most systems is not something that I like. It's usually very small, it's maybe not a font that I like, and so I usually do some customizations there that are part of my user profile. I bring it along with me when I sit down at a new system. So if I want to go in and take a look at that, what we do is inside of GNOME, if you take a look at your menus up top, or inside of GNOME Terminal, we can go to Edit, and under Edit, you'll see two options. There's Preferences and Profile Preferences. And that is a little bit confusing. Like, why do I have these two things that are very similar? Preferences, those are settings that affect the entire terminal, right? Not just my little session inside of it. And the Profile Preferences, that's what affects my session. So let's start with Preferences and kind of see what's in there. You'll find that there's actually not a whole lot of options tucked away inside of this. So taking a quick glance at it, first I've got Show Menu Bar by default. Well, I need my menu bar, that's where I have the options. But if you've memorized all the keyboard shortcuts, you might not need that menu bar. You can get a little more screen real estate. Enable mnemonics, such as Alt-F to open the file menu, right? Those are turned off by default because we might need to send Alt-F to the program we're running inside of the terminal, right? But if you use those, you can turn it on. This is one that I usually turn off. This is on by default. Enable the menu accelerator key, F10 by default, which means if you hit F10 and then the next series of keys you hit is being sent to the menu for the terminal. Well, there's a lot of programs like Midnight Commander that I ran earlier. F10 is the key to exit Midnight Commander. If it's mapped to the terminal, that's going to make it where I can't exit Midnight Commander, right? So that'd be bad.
Yeah, open another terminal and then...
yeah. You could. You find a way around it.
Yeah.
But it's neat that we can come in and we can change that. And then you've got like themes. So we can do the light theme or the dark theme. You've got shortcuts that you can define. You can override keyboard shortcuts to set them to different things. Maybe you just don't find the default ones very intuitive. The profiles I'll talk about in a second. And then the encodings, right? If you're here in the US, it usually defaults to UTF-8, which is probably what this one is at. Let's find out. Yeah, UTF-8. But if you're in another country, if you're typing in other languages, well, UTF-8 is designed to be universal. That's what the whole U part is. But some languages still aren't perfect with that. So you'll see where there's other character sets that you can use, like Greek or Cyrillic, to be able to support your alphabet and render it better on screen. So those are things that we can change. None of those settings that I just showed you have to do with font size or color or performance of the console itself. So these are all just kind of general settings that apply to the terminal. Under Profiles, this is where we create profiles. And you'll have one profile by default. It's usually called default. I've renamed mine Don's Custom, but you call it whatever you want. You can have one or more profiles, and the profiles are where all your special settings really end up. That's where the real work gets done inside of these things. So if I have a shared computer that I use alongside Daniel, He might have his profile, and I have my own profile, and we can easily switch back and forth. Now, that doesn't normally happen, because normally Daniel has his own user account, I have my own user account, so we don't bump heads. Right?
Never the twain shall meet, right?
Yeah. But I might need some different profile based on applications that I'm running, right? I might have a certain color scheme that works well with one application and doesn't work well with another. So I can come in and I can create those. But a lot of times we'll just have one. You can use the default one if you want, and you can edit it to customize it how you want. Now, I went into the preferences screen, and if I choose edit, it's going to take me to the profile preferences. That's the same as if I had gone back out here and gone to edit and profile preferences. Right? The difference is this immediately takes me to the Don's custom profile versus going through the regular preferences screen. I can pick which profile I want to edit if I have more than one profile. So that's the only difference. If I just want to modify the profile I'm currently in, I can go to edit and profile preferences. I jump right in there. All right. And now we can jump in and start to customize things. Now I want to show you some of the standard things that I customize. Right? The first thing, just the very first thing that I do is go to a custom font. All right? A lot of times the default font is set to monospace 10. And a 10-pitch font on a high-resolution monitor is very, very difficult to read. Now, I'm getting older, a little bit older each day, and it gets harder and harder for me to see. So I need a slightly bigger font. You might be young, you're 18, you're in high school, and you can read microscopic fonts, and so you set the highest resolution font. Good
Or
for
you're
you.
Mike Roderick.
One of our other hosts, he always tiny fonts. I don't understand it. But you can pick whatever font you want, and you can make that large or small. You can actually choose from a number of different fonts. Maybe I've seen people where they like the ones that look like cursive or whatever. You can get all kind of fancy pants for this stuff if you want. And you can load custom fonts too if you really want to go crazy.
Those are good. I like that.
Some don't work as well, so, so you might not want those. We're not going to pick the Wingdings font or whatever, Webdings. But you can customize this to be pleasing to you. If you're going to be working in this terminal a lot, you want it to be something that makes sense. But for me, it's normally the font size that impacts me the most, and I can see that right down here. I've got mine at a 16 pitch. You might need to go even larger. If you're on a super high resolution monitor, you might want it at 24 or something higher like that. But usually 10 or 11 is the default, and for me, that's just too small. So we can customize that. After that, there's other things we can customize, like the initial terminal size. Okay. Now the default here. Let's do this. Let me get out of this one, and I'm going to go and I'm going to switch. I'm going to go into my preferences and profiles. All right. And I'm going to create a new profile here. Right. And this is just at the default. So see how it's monospace 12. Slightly off on that. But the initial terminal size is 80 and 24, right? So that's kind of the default settings here for this unnamed profile that I've created. So I'm going to take that profile, and so we've got this unnamed profile right there, and I'm going to switch my terminal to use that. Now, you probably noticed the option where I can pick the default profile that's going to be used, and right now it's going to default to Don's Custom, so I'm going to choose unnamed. And the reason I'm doing that is I want it to just launch when I first launch. We can always switch when we launch a new terminal, when we open one from an existing terminal, but when you open a new one, it takes that default value. And so here's the default terminal. And you'll see kind of my point. It's really small. It's hard to read. It's not necessarily the ideal situation. It's also not very wide. Okay. Now, I can come in and hit Control-Shift+ and make it bigger. Okay. But that's a one-time thing. If I come up here and say like File, Open Terminal, and so I actually get choices now between which profile I want to use, I can open another one unnamed and see how the new one comes back small. It even does that with tabs, which is super annoying. If I go to open a tab and I do it unnamed, see how this tab is small and then this tab is big. As I switch tabs, it's changing. That's pretty annoying too.
I feel like I'm on psychedelics watching that. Oh, what's going on here?
It's usability, right?
Yeah.
We have to get in here and kind of customize this to meet our needs, right? That's just really the whole point of having these profiles, is being able to set them to whatever it is that our system needs. So if I go back into my preferences, I can change that default profile back to mine, and I can edit it. But I like to modify the font size and then the width of the terminal. The terminal itself will default to 80 by 24 because that's what the old dummy terminals used. The mainframe terminals I mentioned, they were 80 characters wide and 24 characters or lines tall, right? that can be kind of small on our new widescreen monitors. Most people have 16:9 monitors these days, so it makes sense to make the terminal a little wider. I usually go 100 by 24 like that is kind of my default. A few other things you can tweak: the terminal bell. Terminal bell is super annoying. Anytime maybe you backspace to delete characters and there's no more characters, every time you hit backspace, it goes ding, ding, ding. It gets annoying. Some people really like that, right? So we can leave that bell on or off. Mine's on, but I keep my laptop muted, so it doesn't matter. But you might want to disable that. You can specify a command. When you first launch the terminal, what does it do? Well, the default is it drops you to command prompt, and it sits there, and it waits for you to do something. But if there's a command that you run every time you launch the terminal, you can come in here and tell it, hey, I want you to run a command. Maybe I don't want it to go to a regular terminal. Maybe I want it to go to something special like tmux. Tmux is a special kind of terminal that, it's very much like Terminator that lets you slice up the screen, but it does it all with keyboard shortcuts, and it does it all in one session. It's almost borderline magic. So I could say, hey, when I launch a shell, I want you to just go straight into tmux. Don't go into bash or whatever my default shell happens to be. So you can override those values here. Normally we don't do that, but you could do it. The colors are kind of fun. In the olden days, right, we just had white text on a black background, or maybe the other way around, right, a black background or black text on a white background.
Or your favorite, black text on a black background.
Yeah.
It's always great.
the stealth shell, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But you can change it. You'll see like green on black to get that true retro feel. If you want to really go like a dummy terminal, you can do that. But all of these color settings can be overridden from within the terminal itself. And you'll see that pretty frequently when you're working with these terminals, because things get colorized. Like when I pulled up my directory listing, different files had different colors. That's being determined by the shell that I'm using. So the terminal has a default color set, and that's really what you're picking here, and then the shell can override that at different places. And there's some default schemes that you can choose from. See down here, mine's set to custom for some reason. I don't remember customizing it. But you can choose from some of these other default color schemes to pick whatever it is that you want and get things kind of set to your liking. Right? The scrolling tab is kind of an important one for me. As you run commands, there's oftentimes where commands will exceed the top row of your screen. It'll scroll off the screen, and you need to be able to scroll back and see it. Some operating systems have that scroll back buffer set really small. If it's only set to 100 lines, and I do a yum update, and there's more than 50 updates, it's going to generate more than 100 lines, I'm going to lose messages that were at the top. Okay, that's how it works. So I need to have a scroll back buffer that's big enough to let me scroll back to see messages. Now, you don't want to go too big, because where does that scroll back buffer get stored? It's stored in RAM. So the bigger your scroll back buffer, the more RAM you're eating up. Now, this day and age, we usually have tons of RAM, so it's not that big of a deal. But you don't want to set this to be millions of lines stored in RAM. So 10,000 here is actually a really good number. That's a huge number of lines to scroll back and see, but without consuming too much memory. But you might want to tweak that and change it, make it smaller, make it bigger. You certainly have that option.
Well, Don, I know a lot of people like to, and with these newer terminals, they have the ability to increase the transparency of the terminal. Very cool stuff, kind of an effect thing.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a personal thing, right?
It is. I hate it. But
yeah, I've noticed that you're not a huge fan.
No, I absolutely hate it. Here it is. Transparent background. If you watch a hacker movie,
any hacker movie,
they love the transparent terminals. I don't know why. It's like, I've got this readable terminal. Let's make it less readable. The transparency, right? So if I turn that on, this transparent background, what it does is it takes the background of your terminal and makes it where you kind of see through it. And the idea behind that is, if I have multiple terminals, right? So let me close out of this. I'm going to open up a new terminal, right? And I'm in here and I'm doing work. Well, see how you can see my wallpaper through the terminal now? You can see the big 7 or
Linux.
The word Linux
Yeah.
up there. Yeah, that I'm seeing through my terminal. And if I open up another terminal window, see how I can see the old terminal through my new terminal?
It gets super confusing, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. I think the idea was, if I needed some information from the other terminal, I can see it while I'm in here. But in practice, what happens is you end up with just overlapping stuff, and it becomes really confusing and difficult to read. And this is just terminal windows, right? Maybe I've got a web page open, and so I'm browsing to IT Pro TV, and so I'm browsing the internet. There we go. And so I fire open my terminals. and I can kind of see through them. And I've got the transparency set at 50%. That's
Yeah.
probably a little too aggressive here. If we were to tweak that down a bit, it creates a kind of artistic effect that some people like. I absolutely hate it, but some people, boy, they just love that stuff. So if I take that transparent background and let me ratchet it down to a more reasonable level, right? Now you can still sort of see the web page behind it, but it's not totally in the way. You can get that, and it creates a nice little artistic effect. There are some distros that have this set by default. Again, I usually just come in and disable that transparent background. Now I can read everything nice and neat. That's the way that I like it.
Now, Don, I know we're running super short on time, but I was wondering if you could just touch on some of the one of the major things that we do inside of our computing experience, which is copy, cut, or paste.
Okay.
Can we do this in the terminal, and can we go from like your web browser to the terminal?
Yeah, you can, but it does get a little bit tricky, right? So normally when you're in an application, like if I'm in a web browser back here, and I want to copy Enjoy IT training courses, right? So I want to copy this little marketing slogan. I can take that and I can hit Control-C on my keyboard, and that copies. And then when I go up here, I can hit Control-V, and it pastes, right? Well, that works. And it even works in a lot of terminals, but it doesn't work in every terminal. And the main reason is that Control-C is usually a breaking command. It's how you abort a command. So for example, if I start pinging some server, it's going to ping, and it's going to ping forever until I hit Control-C. Control-C tells it to stop, right? Control-C doesn't tell it to copy, it tells it to stop. And so if I highlight some text, like with my mouse here, I'll highlight some text and hit Control-C, it didn't copy. And if I do Control-V, it doesn't do much anything, right? So those traditional copy and paste don't quite work the way that you might expect them to. Now, you can always use your mouse, right, which is a little bit anti-Unix, but we're not in Unix, right? We're in Linux. I can highlight with the mouse, and I can right-click, and I can choose copy, and then I can right-click, and I can choose paste, and there we go, it worked, right? But a lot of terminals will remap shortcuts to something that actually does work inside of a terminal. Whichever terminal you pick, you'll need to look at what its defaults are, right? Back up here in Edit and Preferences, we had the shortcuts. And right here was where I could define a number of shortcuts, including copy and paste. And if you take a look at the ones that are in here, it's got Shift Control-C, Shift Control-V. So instead of just hitting Control-C, I hit Shift as well. And that's how it avoids sending the breaking command, right? So that'll make sure that it does that and ensures that I can copy it. So now I could come in and I could highlight something, and I could hit, I don't usually do Shift Control, I usually do Control Shift, but Control Shift C to copy, and then Control Shift V, and there I'm pasting what I highlighted. All right. Now in the GNOME terminal, that's the way you do it. That's the shortcut that you remember. In some terminals though, they do what's called copy on highlight, where if you just highlight something, the moment you let go of your mouse, it copies it into the clipboard. And the moment you right-click, it immediately pastes that data. Right? The GNOME terminal doesn't do that, but there are terminals that do, and they usually just call that copy on click or copy on highlight. So as you dig through the options of your terminal, you may find something that indicates that. I don't think I have that option here at all. If we take a look at like even shortcuts, I'm pretty sure GNOME terminal doesn't support that. But like I said, yours might, and if you dig through your options, you may find it and see where you can turn that on or customize that option. So that's another way that we might do that. But again, it does vary a bit from terminal to terminal.
All right. Well, Don, we've run out of time with this episode. I know you have more to go when jumping into the shells area, or the arena, should I say.
Yeah.
But looks like we'll have to wait for a part 2 on that. We do thank you for joining today. Is there anything you'd like to part our guests with before we go?
You know, I certainly didn't get to every terminal in the world. There's hundreds of them, and you might have a favorite one. I know I left out Console, the one from KDE. KDE's Console has a neat little bookmark feature where you can bookmark folders. As you navigate your file system, you can bookmark a location. And so when you launch that console, you can say, go to this bookmark, and it jumps right to that location on the file system.
Very nice.
It's a neat feature. All of those terminals, they have bright, shiny spots that make them great to use. They usually have a couple of cons that make them not so great. You've just got to find the one that's perfect for you. And it's trial and error. Usually they're very small, so it's easy to install a bunch of them. I probably have 5 different terminals installed here. You know, just take a look at what you've got and find out what one you like, and just know that it's pretty easy to move to another one if you choose to.
That's right. Doesn't it? It never hurts to test drive something, right? You're not locked into it. You don't like it. You delete it, and you move on to the next thing. Don, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your expertise on this and imparting that into us. But as I've said, we're out of time for this episode. Definitely come back for part 2 as we look into shells. But as for this episode, we are going to go ahead and sign off. For IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.